Midnight secrets usually stay buried, but what happens when a ruthless underworld kingpin discovers the horrifying truth about the woman he secretly loves? Tonight, we dive into a chilling tale of power, abuse, and a 2 a.m. revelation that unleashed a bloodbath on the streets of Boston. Rain lashed against the heavy, ornate windows of the Fairmont Copley Plaza ballroom, blurring the vibrant city lights of Boston into smeared streaks of gold and red. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent. High society's finest mingled under crystal chandeliers, clinking champagne flutes and trading secrets veiled as pleasantries. Genevieve Hayes stood near a towering arrangement of white orchids, her posture rigid, her smile practiced and hollow. She wore an emerald silk gown with a meticulously designed high neckline. To the fashion columnists in the room, it was a bold, vintage-inspired choice. To Genevieve, it was armour. It concealed the yellowish-purple shadows blooming along her collarbone. Declan Walsh, her fiancé, stood 2 feet away, holding court with a group of federal judges and city councilmen. Declan was Boston's deputy district attorney, a man whose public persona was carved from marble. Righteous, charismatic, and heavily favoured for the upcoming mayoral race. He was the city's golden boy. But as Genevieve watched him laugh, charming the room with a perfectly timed anecdote, a cold tremor crawled up her spine. She knew the monster that lived beneath the tailored Tom Ford suits. She knew the weight of his backhand and the terrifying, dead-eyed silence that always preceded his violent outbursts. Across the sprawling ballroom, standing entirely still in a pocket of shadows near the terrace doors, was Lorenzo Bianchi. Lorenzo did not belong in the polite society of Beacon Hill, though his wealth eclipsed almost every man in the room. He was the quiet, undisputed head of the Bianchi Syndicate, a family that controlled the port of Boston and ran a vast, untraceable empire of logistics, real estate, and darker, unspoken trades. Lorenzo was a man carved from violence, yet he operated with a terrifying, icy composure. He rarely attended these political fundraisers, only showing up to ensure certain palms remained greased and his legitimate fronts remained undisturbed. But tonight Lorenzo wasn't looking at the politicians. His dark, piercing gaze was locked entirely on Genevieve. They had met 3 months prior at her antique restoration studio on Charles Street. Lorenzo had brought in a water-damaged 18th century leather-bound ledger, a family heirloom, he claimed. Genevieve had treated him not as a feared mob boss, but as a regular patron. She had spoken to him with a soft, genuine passion for her craft that had inexplicably pierced his hardened exterior. Lorenzo had found himself returning to her shop week after week, bringing more books, lingering in the scent of aged paper and binding glue just to hear her voice. He knew she was engaged to Declan Walsh. The knowledge sat like a rusted blade in his gut, but Lorenzo was a man of discipline. He observed from a distance. However, Lorenzo's life in the underworld had trained him to read people, to spot a liar, a traitor, or a victim from a mile away. As Lorenzo watched her tonight, his jaw tightened. He noticed how Genevieve flinched by a fraction of a millimetre when Declan abruptly raised his hand to flag down a waiter. He saw the way her eyes darted to the exits, calculating distances like a trapped animal. He saw the subtle, agonizing stiffness in her left shoulder when she reached for her glass. "Mr. Bianchi," a smooth voice interrupted his thoughts. Lorenzo shifted his gaze to find Declan Walsh approaching, a predatory smile plastered on his face, with Genevieve trailing slightly behind him. "Walsh," Lorenzo replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to drop the temperature in their immediate vicinity. "I didn't expect to see you at a charity gala," Declan said, his tone laced with a subtle, arrogant edge. "I suppose even the shipping industry needs some good PR. We all have our civic duties," Lorenzo said smoothly, though his eyes bypassed Declan entirely to rest on Genevieve. Up close, the forced nature of her smile was glaring. Her eyes, usually a vibrant, warm hazel, were dull and glossed with exhaustion. "Miss Hayes, it's a pleasure to see you outside the studio." "Mr. Bianchi," Genevieve whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She looked down, unable to meet his intense stare. Declan's hand suddenly clamped down on Genevieve's waist. It looked like an affectionate gesture to the room, but Lorenzo's sharp eyes caught the way Declan's fingers dug ruthlessly into her ribs. Genevieve's breath hitched, a tiny gasp of pain she quickly disguised as a cough. "Genevieve was just telling me she's feeling a bit fatigued," Declan said, his grip tightening further. "We should be going. A pleasure, Bianchi. Keep your shipments clean." Lorenzo didn't respond to the veiled threat. He watched Declan steer Genevieve away. Just before they disappeared into the crowd, Genevieve looked back over her shoulder. For one split second, the mask slipped, and Lorenzo saw it. Stark, unadulterated terror. That look burned itself into Lorenzo's mind. The Mafia boss, a man who had ordered executions without a second thought and built an empire on calculated ruthlessness, felt an unfamiliar, violent churning in his chest. He didn't just want to break Declan Walsh's grip on her. He wanted to dismantle the man's entire existence, but moving against a high-profile DA without proof would bring the federal government down on his family. Lorenzo needed to wait. He needed to be sure. 3 weeks later, the fragile facade of Genevieve's life violently collapsed. It was a Tuesday night. The Boston air was thick with a freezing torrential downpour that turned the streets into slick black mirrors. Inside the Walsh estate in Chestnut Hill, the atmosphere was a powder keg. Declan's latest task force, an initiative meant to cripple the Bianchi family's port operations, had spectacularly failed that afternoon. Warrants had been thrown out by a judge Lorenzo had quietly compromised months ago. Humiliated and enraged, Declan came home smelling of scotch and blind fury. Genevieve had tried to make herself invisible, retreating to the upstairs library, but there was no escaping him. When Declan found her, the explosion was immediate and merciless. He accused her of mocking him, of looking at him with pity. Words quickly escalated to shattering glass as he threw his crystal tumbler against the wall. Then, the physical violence began. It was the worst beating she had ever endured. Declan was entirely unhinged, taking out the professional emasculation he suffered at the hands of Lorenzo Bianchi on the one person he completely controlled. When he finally stopped, leaving her crumpled on the Persian rug, breathing heavily, he adjusted his cuffs. "Clean yourself up," Declan spat, his voice eerily calm again. "We have a press breakfast at 8. If you embarrass me, I will kill you, Genevieve. I mean it." He locked the heavy mahogany door from the outside, leaving her in the dark. For hours, Genevieve lay there, the coppery taste of her own blood pooling in her mouth. Every breath felt like shattered glass in her chest. But as the clock struck 1:30 a.m., something inside her finally snapped. It wasn't bravery. It was absolute, primal survival. She knew with terrifying certainty that if she stayed in this house, Declan would eventually follow through on his threat. She would be just another tragic accident, a fall down the stairs, a slip in the shower. Pushing through the agonizing pain, she dragged herself to the window. It was a second-story drop onto a slanted awning, then down to the wet grass. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't take her purse. She just climbed. The fall tore the skin from her palms and sent a blinding shockwave of pain through her bruised ribs, but she didn't stop. Genevieve ran through the freezing rain, her torn dress clinging to her battered frame, her bare feet slipping on the pavement. She managed to hail a passing night shift cab on Route 9. When the driver asked her where she wanted to go, her mind went blank. She couldn't go to the police. Declan was the law in this city. She couldn't go to her friends. Declan had isolated her from them long ago. There was only one place in all of Boston where the law did not reach, and only one man powerful enough to make Declan Walsh hesitate. "The seaport," she choked out. "The Bianchi Holdings building." At 2 a.m, Lorenzo Bianchi was sitting in his cavernous, glass-walled office overlooking the harbour, reviewing ledgers. The building was empty, save for his top-tier security team. The rain hammered against the reinforced glass, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that was suddenly broken by the harsh buzz of his intercom. "Boss," came the tense voice of Marco, his head of security. "You need to come down to the lobby, now." "I'm working, Marco. Handle whatever it is," Lorenzo replied sharply. It's the girl from the antique shop, boss. Genevieve. She's in a bad way. The pen in Lorenzo's hand snapped in two. He didn't take the elevator. Lorenzo took the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs in a chaotic, unfamiliar rhythm. When he pushed through the heavy security doors into the dimly lit marble lobby, the sight that greeted him made the breath freeze in his lungs. Genevieve was sitting on a leather bench, shivering violently, wrapped in an oversized tactical jacket that one of his heavily armed guards had draped over her. She was soaked to the bone, her hair matted to her face with rainwater and blood. Lorenzo crossed the lobby in 3 long strides, falling to his knees in front of her. His guards immediately stepped back, giving them space, their eyes averted. "Genevieve," Lorenzo breathed, his voice stripped of all its usual cold authority. It was raw, desperate. She flinched violently at the sound of her name, shrinking back into the jacket. Slowly she lifted her head, and the dim lobby lights fell upon her face. Something inside the ruthless Mafia boss fundamentally, irreparably shattered. Her left eye was swollen shut, surrounded by a horrifying tapestry of black and purple. Her lip was split, still sluggishly leaking blood down her chin. Through the gap in the jacket, Lorenzo saw her ruined dress and the stark, brutal imprints of heavy hands, bruised into the delicate skin of her neck. In his world, Lorenzo had seen unspeakable violence. He had ordered it, orchestrated it, and witnessed the gruesome aftermath of mob wars. But looking at Genevieve, the gentle, passionate woman who carefully restored history with her delicate fingers, broken and bleeding, a devastating tectonic shift occurred within his soul. The calculated, patient businessman vanished. In his place awoke a deeply primal, terrifyingly cold apex predator. "Who?" Lorenzo whispered, though he already knew the answer. His hands hovered over her, desperate to comfort, terrified of causing her more pain. He said he would kill me," Genevieve sobbed, her whole body shaking as she looked into Lorenzo's dark eyes. "I didn't know where else to go. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." "Shh. No, do not apologize," Lorenzo interrupted, his voice dropping to a fierce, steady whisper. He gently cupped the uninjured side of her face. His thumb, rough with calluses, delicately wiped a mixture of rainwater and tears from her cheek. "You are safe. I swear to you on my life, you're safe here." Genevieve let out a broken, exhausted whimper and leaned her weight forward. Lorenzo caught her, wrapping his strong arms around her fragile, battered body, pulling her securely against his chest. He held her as she wept into his shirt, his chin resting gently on the top of her wet hair. Over her trembling shoulder, Lorenzo's eyes lifted. The tender, raw emotion that had just cracked his face open was instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated murder. He looked at Marco, who was standing by the doors, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Lorenzo didn't have to shout. He didn't have to explain. "Call the private doctor," Lorenzo commanded, his voice echoing through the marble lobby like a death knell. "Then wake up the capos, all of them. Tell them to arm up." Marco nodded slowly, recognizing the dangerous, dead-eyed look on his boss's face. And Walsh boss, Lorenzo carefully gathered Genevieve into his arms, lifting her effortlessly off the bench to carry her upstairs to his private penthouse. He paused at the elevator, his eyes locked on the storm raging outside the glass doors. "Declan Walsh is already a dead man," Lorenzo stated quietly. "He just doesn't know it yet." Grey morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Lorenzo's fortified penthouse, casting long, pale shadows across the minimalist furniture. In the centre of the massive master bedroom, Genevieve slept fitfully beneath dark silk sheets. A private physician, an older man who had spent decades patching up gunshot wounds and knife lacerations for the Bianchi syndicate, quietly packed his medical bag. He had reset her fractured ribs, stitched the deep cut on her lip, and administered a heavy dose of painkillers. Lorenzo stood motionless by the window, a glass of untouched bourbon in his hand. He had not slept. He had merely watched her chest rise and fall, his mind calculating 1,000 different avenues of destruction. She will heal, Lorenzo, the doctor murmured softly, stepping out into the hallway. The bruising will look worse before it fades, but there is no permanent internal damage. However, the psychological trauma, she needs time and absolute safety. She has it, Lorenzo replied, his voice devoid of any inflection. Thank you, Arthur. When the heavy oak door clicked shut, Lorenzo finally moved. He approached the edge of the bed and sat down with agonizing care, ensuring the mattress barely shifted. Genevieve's face was turned toward him, her battered features highlighted by the bleak morning sun. Even broken, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. A fierce, possessive instinct coiled tight within his chest. He reached out, his knuckles grazing the uninjured side of her jaw. Her eyelashes fluttered, and she dragged her eyes open. Panic flared instantly in her hazel irises, but it dissolved the moment she recognized his face. "Lorenzo," she rasped, her throat dry and raw. "I am here," he answered, pouring a glass of water from the nightstand and helping her sit up just enough to drink. "You're safe. No one knows you are here. No one will ever touch you again." Genevieve slumped back against the pillows, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. "Declan will look for me. He has the police. He has the mayor. He will tear the city apart." Lorenzo offered a smile that did not reach his cold obsidian eyes. "Let him try. Declan Walsh is a king of paper and politics. He operates in a world of rules. I do not." Leaving her to rest, Lorenzo descended into the subterranean levels of the Bianchi Holdings building. His private war room was already occupied. 5 of his most ruthless lieutenants sat around a mahogany conference table, the air thick with tension and the smell of dark, roasted coffee. They were men of violence, enforcers, fixers, and strategists who controlled the pulse of Boston's criminal underground. "Sit down," Lorenzo commanded, taking his place at the head of the table. The room fell into absolute, terrifying silence. As of 2 hours ago, the unspoken truce between this family and Deputy District Attorney Declan Walsh is null and void. Dominic, his second in command, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Boss, Walsh is heavily guarded by the feds. Hitting a DA brings the alphabet agencies down on our ports. It's bad for business." "I'm not going to hit him," Lorenzo said softly, leaning his forearms on the table. "I'm going to erase him. I want his financial backers terrified. I want his political allies blackmailed. I want every dirty secret, every bribed judge, every offshore account he uses to launder his campaign money exposed. By midnight tonight, I want Declan Walsh to realize he is entirely alone in this city." The lieutenants exchanged glances. They had never seen Lorenzo like this. He was usually the voice of restraint, the businessman who favored negotiation over bloodshed. Today, he was a warlord demanding a siege. "What's the catalyst, boss?" Dominic asked cautiously. Lorenzo's eyes darkened, turning entirely black. "He touched something that belongs to me. You have your orders. Dismantle his life." For the next 48 hours, the underworld executed a masterclass in psychological and financial warfare. Declan Walsh awoke on Wednesday morning to find his sprawling Chestnut Hill estate eerily quiet. His private security detail, off-duty cops he paid under the table, had simply vanished, their retainers refunded. When he attempted to access his offshore Cayman's account to pay for a private investigator to track Genevieve, the funds were gone, wiped clean by Bianchi's elite cyber division. By Wednesday afternoon, an anonymous dossier was delivered to the desk of every major news outlet in New England. It contained irrefutable proof of Declan's extortion, his ties to corrupt developers, and audio recordings of him threatening city council members. The DA's office was immediately swarmed by federal agents, not to protect Declan, but to freeze his assets and strip his credentials. Declan was suffocating, trapped in a rapidly shrinking box. He tried to call his allies, the powerful men who had dined at his table just weeks ago, but his calls went straight to voicemail. The police commissioner refused to see him. Even his own defense attorney abruptly resigned, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest. Panic, raw and unadulterated, began to set in. Declan Walsh realized he was not just being investigated, He was being hunted, and he knew exactly who had orchestrated the collapse. He had pushed Genevieve too far, and she had run to the only predator in Boston larger than him. Paranoia is a slow, suffocating poison, and by Friday evening it had consumed Declan Walsh entirely. Stripped of his badge, his wealth, and his arrogant invincibility, he was nothing more than a desperate man running out of time. He knew the indictment from the federal government was coming on Monday, but he also knew Lorenzo Bianchi would never let him live to see the inside of a courtroom. Declan packed a single duffel bag with whatever cash he had left in his personal safe and a snub-nosed revolver. He planned to drive north to Canada, slip across the border, and disappear into the rural wilderness. He managed to slip out the back of his estate, avoiding the reporters camped on his front lawn. The heavy fog rolling off the Charles River provided a thick, concealing blanket as he drove his unassuming sedan toward the outskirts of the city. He kept his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He made it as far as an abandoned industrial park on the edge of the city limits. Suddenly, the headlights of his car illuminated a massive black SUV parked horizontally across the exit ramp. Declan slammed on the brakes, the tyres shrieking against the wet asphalt. Before he could throw the car into reverse, two more SUVs boxed him in from behind. The trap had snapped shut. The doors of the SUVs opened, and half a dozen men in dark trench coats stepped out, their expressions unreadable, heavy weapons held casually at their sides. Declan scrambled for his revolver, but his hands were shaking so violently he dropped it onto the floorboard. The men didn't shoot. They simply walked forward, shattered the driver's side window with the butt of a rifle, and dragged Declan out into the freezing mist. They threw him onto the wet pavement, kicking his legs out from under him so he was forced to his knees. From the shadows of the lead SUV, a figure emerged. Lorenzo Bianchi walked with the terrifying, unhurried grace of an executioner. He wore a tailored black overcoat, the collar turned up against the damp wind. His face was a mask of cold, sculpted marble. Declan looked up, his face pale, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Bianchi," he choked out, trying to summon a fraction of his former authority. "You can't do this. If I disappear, the feds will tear your operations apart." Lorenzo stopped a few feet away, looking down at the ruined man. "The feds think you're a flight risk, Walsh. They think you emptied your accounts and ran like a coward. They won't look for you. No one is looking for you." "I'll give you everything," Declan pleaded, the arrogance finally shattering, replaced by pathetic, grovelling terror. "The roots, the judges, the political leverage, it's yours." "You have nothing I want," Lorenzo said softly, stepping closer. He crouched down so he was eye level with Declan. "Except your life." "Is this about her?" Declan spat, a sudden, desperate flare of spite breaking through his fear. "Genevieve, you're destroying your own empire over a broken little antique dealer." Lorenzo's hand shot out with blinding speed, wrapping around Declan's throat. He squeezed, cutting off Declan's air supply instantly. The politician clawed helplessly at Lorenzo's iron grip, his eyes bulging. "Do not speak her name," Lorenzo whispered, his voice dropping to a demonic, vibrating register. "You broke the only thing in this world that I considered pure. You put your hands on her, you made her bleed, and for that, I am going to make sure your name is erased from the earth." Lorenzo released his grip, letting Declan collapse onto the pavement, gasping violently for air. Lorenzo stood up, adjusting his cuffs with meticulous, chilling precision. He turned his back on Declan, signaling to his men. "Make it slow," Lorenzo commanded, his voice carrying over the wind, "and leave nothing to be found." As Lorenzo walked back to his vehicle, the muffled sounds of a desperate struggle and a single, suppressed gunshot echoed through the fog. Lorenzo didn't flinch. He simply got into the back of his SUV and ordered his driver to take him home. 3 weeks later, the underworld had settled back into a quiet rhythm. Declan Walsh was officially declared a fugitive, a disgraced DA who had fled the country to avoid prosecution. The city moved on, forgetting him entirely. Inside the penthouse overlooking the harbour, Genevieve stood in the kitchen, brewing a pot of chamomile tea. The heavy bruising on her face had faded to faint yellowish shadows. She wore one of Lorenzo's oversized cashmere sweaters, her hair pulled back into a loose braid. She was still fragile, still prone to nightmares, but the suffocating terror that had defined her life was gone. She heard the heavy click of the front door unlocking. Lorenzo stepped into the foyer, shrugging off his suit jacket. He looked exhausted, the weight of his empire pulling at the corners of his eyes, but the moment he saw her, his posture softened. He walked into the kitchen, stopping just a few inches away from her. He never pushed. He always let her close the distance. Genevieve looked up into his dark, dangerous eyes that had ordered the deaths of men, eyes that terrified the bravest criminals in the city. But when he looked at her, there was nothing but absolute, unwavering devotion. Genevieve took a step forward, closing the gap, and rested her head against his chest. Lorenzo let out a slow breath, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her tight against his heart. He was a monster to the rest of the world, a kingpin forged in violence and blood. But to her, he was the shield that kept the darkness at bay. She was the one beautiful thing in his brutal world, and he was the shadow that would protect her forever. If this dark descent into Mafia romance, devastating betrayal, and ultimate revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, share this video with your fellow dark romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel right now. Ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our chilling, heart-stopping tales of love and vengeance. What should Lorenzo do next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.